Yeah, hey everyone. Nice to see you all on the same stage at the same time. As we get started, I'll just encourage all of you watching. There's lots of you. There's hundreds of you out there. Go ahead and drop your questions in the chat. I don't have any specific questions prepared. I've just been eagerly writing things down as people talk. But we're more curious about what you're interested in and what sort of questions you might have that you'd want to pose to the panel at large. What I'll start off though is that same question that I posed to Cardo back to Stephanie and Sarah as well. Like, how do you use assistive tech in your work to help inform your designs, or what does that even look like on a practical level? And I'll just let you both fight for it. No,
okay, Sarah, start.
Stephanie first.
Okay. So I personally use a lot of text-to-speech. I haven't read an article in years. I have the Firefox plugin read it to me because I have zero attention span, and most of websites today have too much fluff around it. It's very annoying to read. So that's kind of my personal experience. But yeah, doing a lot of manual testing, like keyboard testing. Keyboard is an assistive technology, in case people forgot. So like real keyboard or virtual keyboard. Doing a lot, like Sarah explained, like make things bigger, 200%, something like that. And I'm also doing a little bit of how is it called? VoiceOver. So on Mac, damn it, screen reader. Sorry, it's been a long day. Screen reader testing, mostly on my own website. At work, it's a little bit more complicated because I work in a very strict environment and they do not have any other screen reader than the one by default on Microsoft, which is not that great. So like enterprise UX is a little bit more complicated, but at least we are already doing like testing with keyboard navigation and checking the accessibility tree in the browser to check what the screen reader is supposed to read, since we do not have screen readers.
Thank you for sharing. Sarah, how about you, especially when it comes to the data visualization work that you do? What does it look like to use assistive tech to help inform your work?
Yeah, so for myself, as I said during my presentation, I use 200% Zoom quite often just for me to be able to read it. And something else that's an assistive tech, in my opinion, that I quite frequently use for myself is some custom style sheets. Like I have this plugin for Chrome where I can write custom CSS for websites I visit. Because when I get migraines, I find it very difficult to focus on a white screen with black text. It's so painful to look at. So I will typically write some custom CSS in those cases to invert the page and to make some red overlay on top of it or something to make it like much more dimmed. So by doing that, like I already get quite familiar with what kind of issues might pop up, and then I know quite well how to test those in my client work. And other than that, like as Stephanie said, I use lots of screen readers. Like typically I start with just what I have on my computer because that's the easiest to use. I have it in front of me, so that's also VoiceOver on Mac. And then when I find issues there, I switch to Windows, where I have like NVDA or Narrator or JAWS or different spot tests with screen readers to check like, oh, here was something that was weird on my device. Is it just like a weird VoiceOver thing, or is it something that is weird across all assistive technologies? And then also like keyboard, can I access the different points on a graph? Can I, if I press enter and space, do the correct actions happen? Where does the keyboard focus shift to afterwards?
Thank you very much. Now, someone in the chat also asked, and I mean, this is a little politically charged, but you know, we don't have to get too deep into there. But where it's been a fight for so long, we're starting to see such a backlash to accessibility, being grouped into DEI. And how do we overcome this when companies in the U.S., as we've been seeing in the news, have been seeming to go backwards? In this direction? Is there something that like we could do at the practical level or at the individual level to reverse the tide, and what sort of like practical recommendations do you see out there? I'll start with Cardo.
Well, I see that, and I was getting very nervous because I already see companies in the UK following suit. And the thing that people need to separate, there is a difference between accessibility and inclusive design and diversity and inclusion. Because accessibility and inclusive design, it doesn't matter who you are, or it doesn't matter where you are. It's good practice for everybody. I mean, it's such a shame that after all these years that we are talking about diversity and inclusion, and now all of a sudden we are backtracking from all that. That's a real shame. But people need to know the difference between that kind of diversity and this kind of design inclusion thing. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Yes. Sarah, Stephanie, how do you encounter that in your own work?
Yeah, here in Norway, we also have accessibility regulations on a government level that are Norway specific, and soon the EU regulations are coming. So something that I'm hoping for, at least for the companies in Europe, is that we can leverage that to some extent to push our clients to not completely give up on accessibility. Because, yeah, I know Trump is making a mess in the US, but there are still more and harsher regulations coming in the EU that we still have to legally comply to. But I also think on like a more activist or political level that it's good to like expose accessibility or like make sure that people become familiar with it, that we keep bringing it up in conversations, that we keep documenting it in our designs, that we keep mentioning it in our pull requests on GitHub, so that people keep being reminded of the importance for it, and new people keep being interested in it and keep engaging themselves in the fight.
Thank you. A bit of a lighter question, just because why not, right? Now, each of you have mentioned different types of resources that you use in your work, particularly when it comes to Figma for helping aid accessibility related decisions. What are your favorite plugins in Figma, or your favorite app resources in general that you would recommend that would have to be part of someone's tool set if they were practicing what you're practicing? We'll start with Stephanie on that one.
I have them all in the blog post. Basically, no. There's a team at eBay who have a Figma plugin that is called Include. That is kind of very easy to understand way to check a couple of things and also document a couple of things without being too overwhelming. So I've seen some accessibility plugin where you can document ARIA roles. Amazing. I do not think a lot of designers understand what an ARIA role is. So I would say if you're a beginner, having less is sometimes more, especially since otherwise you might document something the wrong way and the developer will implement it the wrong way. So yeah, the Include plugin from the eBay team, and they're a very nice team. They are open to feedback. So I really like this one. And then yeah, like I like the color contrast analyzer that is called CCA, because you can install it on your computer, and then if you do not use Figma, you can use it in whatever design tool that you have, then it's perfectly fine.
How about you, Sarah? What are some of your favorite Figma plugins?
Yeah, so I have several contrast checkers, and I think any contrast checker will do the job. I also often use contrast checkers online, because then it doesn't really matter. I don't have to open Figma. If I'm designing in the browser, I can at once just go to the URL, and it's like the WebAIM color contrast checker. And there's another one. It's not really very accessible for screen readers, but there's one that's called Colorable. If you go to it on Google, you'll find it. And the reason I like that one is when I'm talking with like very visual designers who are a bit afraid of accessibility, it's one that has like a very funky, nice looking visual design. So I've typically had some good luck with that one to get like the visual designers who are very afraid that accessibility is boring, to get those on board with it, because it shows examples of high enough contrast with like funky colors. And then another one is the focus order plugin that I mentioned. But there, as Stephanie also said, like there's also the risk that people misdocument, that they like document a focus order that doesn't really make sense, or that they add an area role that doesn't really make sense. So that one comes with a big warning.
Love that. And Cardo, I'll wrap that question up with you.
Yeah. The most used plugin in my Figma is color contrast. I use that all the time, every 5 minutes. But also type scale. That's a plugin where you can set different scales for your typography in terms of perfect fourth and major third and all these things. And I love that. At the beginning on every project, that's my go-to plugin, just trying to sort out the typography when it comes to design, obviously. But yeah, color contrast is something that I use all the time.
And yet it still ends up being one of the most often reported accessibility fails across the internet. We somehow cannot seem to grow past that for some reason.
The reason, I worked in brand agencies for a long time. The reason is brand people, when they do a rebrand or whatever, they don't really involve the right people. They come at it from a marketing point of view. It's more around colors and logo and all these things, but they don't really. We worked on a massive rebrand and accessibility. When I realized, I looked at the color palette and they were very long into the process. None of the colors were accessible, so we had to reverse engineer everything and tweaking things just to make it accessible. And that's because they didn't get the right designers involved in it, and that's the issue with a lot of issues. That's the reason why we have a lot of issues.
You know, I remember working on a rebrand once, and the primary or the principal designer on it came back with a palette of greens and yellows, and it was incredibly difficult to work with. I saw Stephanie's face go, "Uh-oh," with that, and I remember, you know, we had to really think through, well, what does it mean to work with these colors, you know, in a design if we want to maintain a branded identity? And one of those things we're like, well, we don't have to use brand colors for the UI. We can have a UI palette, you know, where we're like, you know, certain greens are going to ensure a good contrast when they're used in this context and vice versa. Are there any types of tips you might have, you know, for working with possibly, you know, inaccessible brand colors that are just inaccessible from the outset?
I go guerrilla style. I'm trying to find a color that is close enough to the brand, the official one. And we'll try to push it. You know, like the orange, I've worked with brands where the blue was almost passing. It was like 3.9. So we just made it a little bit darker. And we went like, okay, it's fine. You do not need to have your print brand identity on the website. And it's like same for or some orange. We made the orange a little bit darker, and it was okay to use it with white buttons. So that was fine. Like, and worst case scenario, I usually don't want to talk to them about that, but you can always have a CSS style sheet. Like, one thing is you can sadly keep your inaccessible website if you have a button that is accessible, where the user can switch it to an accessible theme. That's like the last resort. So if really you lost all your fights with all the branded team, like negotiation, you can do that. Like you can manually have a button, but it means that every time you develop a new component, it needs to be tested. If you have dark mode, light mode, you need to do it twice. So usually I'm like, okay, we could do that, or change a couple of colors and not have to worry about that anymore. And usually when they start estimating how much it will cost to have 2 CSS to maintain, it's like, okay, yeah, fine, let's make the orange darker. It's like, thank you. I'm very sneaky as a designer.
Sarah, one of the things you mentioned in your talk was how back in the day, some of the limitations we had around color were actually to our benefit, because we could use texture instead of color to convey meaning. on something. So like when you show a bar chart, it's like, well, if you have the absence of color, you might have a dotted fill, or you might have a cross hash fill or solid fill on something. Like are there other types of ways that we can overcome color, like just all the color capabilities we have in these days, and yet it makes it even harder to work with color? Like what sort of other little tips or tools do we have to accentuate color so that they can be more accessible?
I think in a way text and illustrations, as I pointed out as well, like instead of having to categorize everything with 10 different colors, because then it just becomes difficult to even like rely on patterns on top of it, because suddenly you have like this big color book. Like one of the things I like to do as well is if things become so complex that I have to think about, okay, we have 20 different colors. How do they all interact with each other? How do I make those different levels like and have enough contrast against each other? When it gets to that level of complexity, I also ask myself, does the chart need to be this complex, or does the UI need to be this complex? Can I split it up in 3 different charts where I can use 3 different shades of like black with the stripes, black with dots or something, and like try to simplify it? Like once it becomes difficult to make accessible, maybe it's just too difficult for anyone and you want to make it a bit simpler, or add text or add illustrations. And yeah.
That's really great. And Cardo, how about you in terms of color accessibility? What is a good tip or a collection of tips that now we could get to not just rely on color to convey meaning? What other types of tools do we have to convey meaning?
Yeah, again, shapes in terms of like what we can use in terms of shapes for example, iconography, for example, when it comes to buttons, etc. Textures, but also just going back to I'm a product designer, I'm an experienced designer. I've been from the beginning, but I have worked within agencies that have been brand agencies. The trick with clients is to convince them that there is your brand colors, but there is also your system colors, like your buttons or your links or your errors, your focus, and all these things. So I think that's a big education piece for brand people, that they need to understand the digital world and how things work. And I think that's not a difficult battle to win in terms of accessibility and design. But again, yeah, like Sarah said, textures, shapes, proximity of things together, positioning, iconography, all these things still help, like if you can't rely on color alone.
Now, I'll ask another question that was posed.
Can I add text?
Stephanie, please chime in.
Yeah. So I have this thing with students where I have a quiz that has some like ways and things they should actually correct or not. And at some point they have triangle that has an exclamation mark saying, and next to it, it says, okay, I don't remember. So, yeah, no more items available. And it's yellow. It's very bright yellow. So they're like, yeah, it doesn't pass the contrast. I'm like, okay, but if I remove the triangle, I still have the information, you know. So you can also have text. Like in my example with the 5 stars, if you had written next to the stars 4 out of 5 stars, then you can have this thing as inaccessible as you want. Technically, for WCAG, it's not a failure. Is it a good usability? Nope. So that's always kind of what we've been repeating. You have technical accessibility and then you have usability. But yeah, if you can have text instead of relying on color, then again, another way.
That's great. Now, this is a question I see come up often, and even though it can be, tiring to ask it over and over again, I still think asking it is important because different people have different perspectives on how to tackle this sort of thing. But how can we effectively convince company management to invest more in accessibility? Beyond compliance, do we frame accessibility as a business opportunity, highlighting that improving accessibility can lead to increased conversions? What is the selling point, or how do we get management to care about these things, as opposed to, to Stephanie's talk's point, oh, we'll fix it later. We don't have time for this. How do we get people to actually care about it? And Stephanie, I'll actually start with you on that because that was, one of those leading questions I had for you, following your talk.
I would say if you want to convince people, you need to understand what makes them click. So I would start by understanding what are the KPIs? What does your company care about? Does your company care about security? Well, explain to them. You would not skip security, so why would you skip accessibility? Does your company care about money? Then yeah, business case for accessibility. Explaining there's like a lot of disabled people. There's different like spectrum of disability. I know someone was able to tie the accessibility to the environment, and like their company was basically doing some greenwashing. So I do not remember how they did that, but like the KPI of the moment was doing things around environment, and they tied accessibility initiatives into that thing, and they were able to get money. So it's like understand what makes the company click and use it. Be sneaky.
Yeah, be sneaky. I can already tell that's a big part of your strategy. Cardo,
I have background in psychology and cognitive bias. I'm usually telling people I work in enterprise, so I do not use a background to do shady things with end users. I'm using it to convince people instead.
Oh, I love that. Cardo, I'm also interested in what you have to say on that because obviously you had some like great advice for 3 sets of people at the end of your talk. How do we get people to care about this at the end of the day? And I mean, you have such a personal story. I'm sure you have a nice hook into that. But what can?
Yeah, there are. So as I said, there is 1.3 billion people living with disability. And that's only on the increase because we are living longer and longer and longer. And the older we get, the more disabled people you will have. And that's a huge market. I mean, 1.3 companies listen to figures, right? But if you just think about it and you make it easy, and this is a lot of research that's done on that type of thing in terms of Airbnb, for example, how much they invest in accessibility and what the return was, etc. So it is definitely that angle that you can come from. But also, Stephanie, I did the same thing with a brand when it came to the green thing. We basically rewrote every article on the website by UX writers, and we changed we reduced the elements that you saw on the screens, and we made everything accessible. The SEO company were not very happy with it because they said people bounce off very quickly, but that's because people were finding their information very quickly and they didn't have to go and troll around the site to see more things. And that way we improved the accessibility, but also we reduced the amount of energy it takes by the servers, in terms of and the effect of it on the carbon emission and the sustainability of that platform. So those two things, and until Donald Trump says we are not doing green anymore, I think those two things can be quite, you say sneaky, but quite effective ways of doing it.
More than 3 people in the chat asked, is Sarah doing any data visualization workshops coming up here? And I'm curious too. Are you?
I'm not. No.
No.
I had one in Freiburg with Smashing Mag, but that was the latest one. I have some coming up with companies, so you can hire me for it. But
and I'll just pose that question as the wrap-up question for everyone here. Like what else, or how can we stay in touch with you? Where can we find you online, and what sort of ways can we support your work? Whether you have upcoming workshops or presentations, or you're working on something and have an initiative going, like how go ahead and plug that right now, Stephanie.
StephanieWalter.design. It's my website. I have a blog and I have all the links in the footer to all my social media.
Awesome. Thank you. And Cardo, for you.
Yes, my website, cardoayub.com. That you can go to LinkedIn from there and you can see some of my work. But also I'm doing these talks in terms of universities, companies. I'm doing all these things just kind of raise awareness a little bit and do as much as I can in terms of trying to open people's eyes. But if you want to connect, my LinkedIn, Cardoayub, and my website, cardoayub.com.
Thank you. And Sarah, we didn't ask you, for your specific plugs on things, but where can we find you online and support your work?
On fossheim.io, that's my website and my tech blog, and also in the footer there I have links to all of my socials. Most active on Mastodon, which is fossheim@frontend.social. And if you liked my bird references during the talk, I also have a photography website. That's Fossheim Point Photography.
Very cool.
Nice.
Now, with that, I just want to thank all three of you for joining us and for being so insightful for us and to help us better understand accessibility as a craft and as a profession, as an industry. It's a big, wide world out there, and like I said at the very top, it can be very intimidating. But you actually put legs on this that make it seem a lot more practical and inviting. So thank you for that. I'm going to invite Jaren up here because there are a few additional things that we have happening around the smashing world that I think are just well worth calling out. So with that, I want to bring up our master of ceremonies. There he is. Look at that. You are muted though, my friend.
Learning from the best there, Geoff.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, I was just being enthusiastic about seeing those people on screen, which I generally get to see in person a little bit once in a while around the world when we do events. So yeah, nice to be here, and what an amazing event we had, Geoff.
Thank you.
One of the things, I mean, Stephanie, besides being an amazing designer, is a little bit too shy to push her own stuff, because we've got a lot of accessibility events and workshops coming up in the coming period. I'll send them to everyone on email, but just as a general note, we've got a free kind of teaser with Stephanie coming up. And then a much longer, much more in-depth workshop with Stephanie on accessible design. We've got Manuel Matuzovic talking about accessibility testing. We've got our own Vitaly Friedman, who knows a thing or two about accessibility as well. So those are only the things in the short term. Then obviously we have our conferences in Freiburg and New York coming up in the fall, where we have a much wider range of topics, generally going from anything from front end to design, but also we'll normally have one or two talks about accessibility or accessibility related, and sometimes an accessibility workshop like we did with Sarah in Freiburg. Maybe we can convince Sarah to do an online workshop with us too. So keep on being posted on that. And for these kinds of events, we have two things coming up. We've got Meets CSS coming up for those who are a little bit more on the technical side on April 1st. Not a joke, really happening. And then we have, I'm not sure we have a slide for that. We have a new event with Brad Frost. We do, yay, yay for us. We have a open up event with Brad Frost, which is a little bit more of an advice show. So it's much more talking about struggles and things that that's not really going well for you, whether it's personal or it's in your career or whatever. And it really is just an advice show. So those are all coming up really soon. So yay, plenty of stuff to do.
Well, Thank you very much, everyone. This is a wonderful event. I had a really great time, and I just want to thank all the attendees here for showing up as well. I know it takes a lot just to dedicate some time out of your workday to come attend a thing like this and to even learn something new yourself. And that's awesome. So thanks for making that time for us, and we'll catch you at the next Smashing Meets.
Bye.
Bye.